Well, choking a horse usually occurs when they have had a long period of time away from both water and feed. And what the most typical presentation that I get is that it's a horse that's gone and taken a large bolus of dry matter or hay in particular and has tried to ingest a large amount of it. And what happens is, because they're slightly dehydrated systemically and the mucous membranes of their back, or the recesses of their throat, are somewhat dehydrated and dry, this dry matter essentially balls up in that area. And what they do is they tend to produce a lot of saliva in order to try to, lubricate this area up. And being that they're slightly dehydrated, it's not such a good thing. Well, the next thing they do is they try to get some water in. Well, they can't absorb or swallow the water because of the obstruction with the choke matter, which usually is dry hay and sometimes feed on top of hay and whatever. And essentially what you see, the typical presentation that I get called in for, is a horse that now has his head down, that basically has food matter coming out his nostrils and draining down, and sometimes out of his mouth as well. More commonly, it's more, it comes out of their nostrils. And I've seen a number of these cases. And so what we do is I will go ahead and sometimes, because these horses get a little frantic, because what they start doing is, because of the area that it's located right back there next to their airway, the epiglottis normally closes off the airway to where nothing can go, they don't contaminate the airway, but unfortunately they still got to breathe simultaneously with this matter coming out. So I'll tranquilize them and then go ahead and pass a stomach tube up into that area and then try to hydrate that bolus of dry matter to try to get it to soften up a bit so it can move on down. And then what we will do is we'll see if we can't get that obstruction cleared right away, and then right away we'll find out that they go to drinking water to get themselves hydrated. And it's typical for a horse, like, I've seen it more commonly in race horses, because that's what I do all the time, but a horse that was drawn off water, raced, and then didn't get enough water, didn't get rehydrated enough during the cooling out process, and then they brought him back to the barn, and then essentially they put him in there with a big bunch of hay in his stall and feed, and all of a sudden he just goes and starts ravishing the hay and feed and gets it all compacted into a dry throat. This can be a life-threatening situation because they can have an aspiration pneumonia from it. And the bigger problem that you can have is that it can cause a tremendous dilation and overstretching of the esophagus and create a large saccule in their esophagus where they lose the muscle tone, and that can be a chronic problem from then on. The biggest problem you have is down the road after you get this area fixed. The problem is that because you've overstretched it, now it constricts down and has a stricture there. So then you have a complicated problem on top of the problem. So it gets to be a situation that is easily repeatable from then on. So you got to be super careful about how you feed your horse from then on. For a while, you have to feed them a gruel, sometimes a mash, which is a feed with a lot of water added to it so it can be swallowed and until this situation subsides. And you got to be careful about the amount of roughage or hay they bring in for a while.
Now, is there a possibility that a horse that has bad teeth could lead to them choking because they can't, chew up hay matter and such?
In older horses, that's not unusual. Or horses that have had a lot of dental problems, you can see that they'll get a large amount of dry matter. They do not masticate it or chew it up the way they should. And normally what they do is, if they're hydrated well and healthy, they'll get a lot of saliva mixed with it, and they'll drink. A lot of horses are dunkers. We call them dunkers. I mean, they'll take their hay, put it in some water, and chew it up while they're doing it so it passes down easily. Yep. But a lot of times what ends up happening is they just don't do that, and their teeth aren't working the way they should. Or if it's a prime example of having a completely healthy horse. You want to check their teeth as well to make sure that the arcades are complete. You don't have maybe one of them overriding, or if you had a tooth missing, that one of the molars grew up into the space of the one above or below the one that we got taken out. Typically the upper molars are the ones that get knocked out or taken out, and the lowers can grow into it, and then they can't masticate properly, so they take in big boluses and they try to swallow it without chewing it up good. So there's your problem in a nutshell. If a horse has a history of choke, you probably have to manage his diet from then on, because it's had more than one episode as a rule. And what that indicates is that you probably have some esophageal dilation or a pocket there, and it's probably going to be predisposed to having that occur from then on. Diet change is probably the best way to manage it. If you're going to go ahead and feed them a certain type of diet with a lot of roughage, beet pulp, this sort of thing, you make sure you get it in a mash or where it has water added to it, and they usually are fed on the ground, so they have to basically slop up the mash and take up the water, and it keeps everything pretty much lubricated and hydrated to where it can pass through the area much easier. As far as managing with roughage from then on, you're better off going with hays that can be wet and chopped up pretty good, or grasses that are, they usually don't have a problem grazing. But as a rule, if you're going to give hay in the stall, you probably might want to go with maybe alfalfa cubes and wet them thoroughly before a horse eats them, so to make sure that you don't have a problem getting in the stricture area anymore.